Hello students, this video is going to go over your second paper in the course, EBP 2. My first piece of advice is, as per usual, make sure you have these guidelines as well as the rubric in front of you before you even start writing your paper. And my second piece of advice would be to pull up the feedback you got on EBP 1. So we leave those comments for you because we want to see you continually improve in each paper in the course. So I recommend pulling up the comments and then pulling up your EBP2 paper and give yourself some notes, like stop using contractions or stop using first person or less direct quotes, etc. So whatever feedback you got from us, write that as a note to yourself in EBP2 so that you can keep improving your papers. So a little bit about this paper. I'm not going to read verbatim the guidelines to you. I'm going to just focus on the areas where we get a lot of questions or where students tend to struggle. So the same guidelines apply for your title page, scholarly sources. You're going to be citing a lot in this paper and your next paper as well. So make sure you're using those scholarly external sources and minimizing use of direct quotes. And really, you shouldn't need any first person in this paper. So when you're writing your introduction, similar to your first paper, this should be really concise. And in your EBP 1, you may have had a little wiggle room and been okay. If you had a slightly longer introduction, you were still able to cover everything in the 3 pages. This paper, you're really going to need that space. So that's why your introduction, I always say keep it less than half a page. Each of these bullet points can be covered in 1 sentence, to be honest. So you're going to introduce the paper. You're going to introduce your PICO question again, verbatim. You're going to share how you found the article. You've already written a whole section of a paper on your literature search strategy and how you found your articles. So this is just a 1 sentence, hey, I used, CINAHL, for example, or this article was found using CINAHL. So don't use first person. And it was selected over others because of blah, 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 and then move on. So your introduction needs to be very concise and to the point. And then again, introduce that article, meaning tell us, this paper is going to be discussing this study that explored the effects of music therapy on pain in adolescents, for example. So be very concise here as well. This also could be just 1 sentence. You don't need to provide the whole title of the article that you're going to be introducing. Frankly, that takes up precious space. But you can just say the quantitative study discussed in this paper, blah, 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 and then cite the articles at the end of that sentence. And that's your way of introducing the article. And then obviously introduce the rest of your paper and the content. Same rule applies here as well from your first paper, in that you may have bigger, broader goals or bigger, broader passions than what is contained in these 3 pages. But what do these 3 pages actually discuss? So keep that in mind when you talk about what is going to be in this paper when you're introducing the rest of the paper. So when you introduce the evidence, so this next section is really kind of telling us, what is this study about? So you're going to give us the purpose of the study. Again, that can be in 1 sentence. The study design, a strength of that design, variables, and sample size. So questions we get here, or issues that we see here, is sometimes you have a design that is very strange or is a combination of designs, or you've never heard of it before and it's really, really hard to find it, but there's one component of it, let's say, that is quasi-experimental or something along those lines. Pick out the piece of the design, if you have one of those scenarios, that is the most straightforward. So if it's quasi-experimental, or if it's a randomized controlled trial with ... lots of other pieces on it, focus on the randomized controlled trial component when you talk about the strengths. So you're going to describe the study design. So you're going to be very explicit about the design. And then when you get into the strengths of that design, if you're in one of those scenarios where you have a very specific or maybe bizarre design, pick out the chunk of the design that is most straightforward. That might be quasi-experimental, randomized controlled trial, etc. So another key issue we see is this part right here. When students are discussing a strength of this type of design, you're not describing a strength of your specific study. You're describing a strength of the fact that they picked a randomized controlled trial, or the fact that they picked a quasi-experimental study. What is a good thing about that design of a study? Why was that a good choice for them? So you're going to select 1 strength and provide rationale and an external citation. So you're not going to cite your own study to say that this was a good idea. You're going to cite maybe your textbook or an external journal article or something like that to say, this is truly a strength of this design. Then you're going to identify the study variables, independent and dependent variables. And some of you may have very complex studies that have a lot of variables. So maybe they have just one independent variable, but maybe 15 dependent variables. You do not have to list all 15 in the body of your paper. What you will do is find the variable or variables that relate to your PICO question and discuss those in the body of your paper. And then in your table, you're going to list out just the variables, the other dependent variables, for example, that were discussed in the paper. So you don't need to provide any extra details or anything like that for those instruments. You can just list them out, but you're going to really drill down and focus on the variables that relate to your PICO question. Another quick thing here, going back to the study design, in your table, you're going to also list the study design there, but this is where you can provide more context. So maybe they did a randomized control trial, but they also happen to have done it from, maybe it was within another study, or maybe it was done in Thailand and it was done over 16 months. And it was also a longitudinal study and da 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 da. So the design itself may fall into one category, but also there might be other details that you want to share that are going to start to take up really valuable space in your paper. You can put those details in the table under the section that talks about the design. So this is where it's really helpful to put the absolutely required content in your paper and then see table one, and in table one you provide a lot more context. Just make sure the requirement part shows up in the body of your paper. But if you have more stuff you want to share, that shows up in table one. So the strength of design we talked about, the study variables we talked about, and then the sample size. So actually share what the sample size was. For some reason, a common issue is students will say the sample was large enough. But what was it? So make sure you overtly state what the sample size was, and then was it appropriate based on the study design? So this should go back to that very first lecture we had on quantitative research, where we talked about, well, how do you know if you have an appropriate sample size? And really what we're asking is, were there enough participants to make a valid conclusion? So make sure you have a rationale here. Again, some students, one of the common errors we see is the sample size was 1,000, which is a large sample, and that's enough. That's not enough for this paper. You need to provide stronger rationale for why 1,000 was enough, not just that everybody can agree that that's a pretty large number. That's not enough of a rationale for this part of the paper. So find a scholarly source. Your textbook is a great resource to back up why or why not a sample size was large enough. And then we're going to move into the results. So you're going to start off with how the data were analyzed. This includes those statistical tests and maybe software. Sometimes they don't mention the software, sometimes they do. If they mention it, you can state it. If they don't, you don't have to. It can just show up in the table. So you're going to talk about the statistical tests that were run. And a lot of times authors will run more than one statistical test, especially in those bigger studies. And they'll list out maybe 5 or 6 different names of statistical tests and what data was run for each test. In your paper, you're going to focus on the one test that was run that gave answers to your PICO question. So maybe your PICO question was wondering about the effects of dolphin therapy on anxiety. And the statistical test that they ran also tested, was there a difference between gender and how it affected anxiety? Was there a difference between the location of where the dolphin therapy was in anxiety? Oh, and this one here just in general was, did anxiety before and after dolphin therapy change? That's the test you're going to talk about in your paper. So you have to read and interpret those statistical tests just a little bit to know which one you're going to talk about in your paper if you had multiple tests. Now in the table, you're going to talk about all the other tests. And when I say talk about, you're really going to just list them. So maybe in your paper, you have ANOVA was the test that they ran that answered your PICO question, but in your table, you're going to talk about maybe they did descriptive statistics, maybe they did a t-test, maybe they did linear regression. You're just going to list those names of tests in the table, but you don't have to provide definitions of every single one of those tests. You can just list them out. Then you're going to talk about the details of data analysis in the table. So that's what I was just talking about. Again, you don't have to provide those definitions. And then what were the findings? So this is something that sometimes when you're in student land, it's really hard to take a step back and be like, oh yeah, we were trying to discover something by conducting this study. So what did they discover? What were the main findings of the study? And there probably were a lot of findings in the study. You need to pull out the findings that relate to your PICO questions in the body of the paper. And then in terms of when you're talking about those findings in the paper, you also want to provide one specific statistical result. And that statistical result isn't just a p-value, because remember, a p-value is associated with another test. So it's telling you if the results of a test were statistically significant. So sometimes what we'll see is the average anxiety score dropped by 5 points, and the p-value is less than 0.05, for example. That would be okay. But if you said anxiety decreased, p is less than 0.05, I'm wondering, well, how much did it decrease? So you need to kind of provide the full picture there. So that would be your statistical test maybe that you provide. And then in terms of the rest of the findings, you can put those in your table. So this will also save you a lot of space. Really focus on the main findings that relate to your PICO in your paper, and then a comprehensive list of findings in your table. Now, if you are one of the lucky few that has a really, really intense quantitative study with tables and tables and tables within their study with all of their results, you do not have to include every single one of those statistical results. This is where we it needs to be a judgment call where you say, this is the main findings of the study. These other findings may not have related to my PICO question, but they're pretty broad findings. You don't have to go down to the granular level and include every single little detailed finding that was in every little box of the table that they have in their article. So if you need a little guidance on this, because a lot of times students will need some guidance on this because it can be tricky, feel free to reach out to your faculty to kind of know, is this too much or is this not enough? And then most importantly is, why are we here in the first place? It's because of a PICO question, right? So you want to look at those findings and think, did they answer my PICO question? Or did they not answer my PICO question? So you're going to talk about how or if the findings of the study answered your PICO question. And then you also want to think about, do these findings support implementation of the intervention or not? So really think about, okay, maybe anxiety decreased, for example, but also I'm going to look at, was this study strong enough to really make the call that we should all go implement dolphin therapy, for example? So you're kind of making a judgment call here in terms of, do the findings support implementation of the intervention or not? And then share some rationale. Now, a couple of things with this last section here. You may have a study that says it didn't work and our results show that really dolphin therapy wasn't very helpful. That is totally fine and actually very valuable information. Same thing as if you say, I don't think we should implement this intervention because this sample size was really small, or their methods were, had a lot of flaws in them, or they didn't provide enough information. So I don't think I would feel comfortable making that call. So I don't think we should implement it for now. Or maybe you're not sure and provide rationale for why you're not sure. But the key is we want you to think about, you didn't just read this study for no reason. You read this study to see how it applies to your PICO question. And then we're going to get into validity of the evidence. So you're going to look at overall, what was the A threat to internal validity and what was A threat to external validity. Common question we get here is, my study didn't have internal validity threats, or my study didn't really have any threats to external validity. To which we usually respond, yes, it did. You just have to find it. And this can be a little tricky sometimes. Sometimes the authors will come out and tell you, here was a threat to internal validity, or here was a threat to external validity. Other times authors won't say it at all, but it requires you to do a little bit of digging. So this right here can take a little bit of time, and we recommend going to your textbook and where it talks about all the different types of threats to internal validity and all the different types of threats to external validity, and look at those and look at your study and see if those apply. Very rarely is there one paragraph in your study that says, this is where we talked about internal and external validity. Usually it's kind of throughout the study. So you have to have read the study a little bit. And honestly, we can discuss with you if you think you found one, whether or not it's truly a threat or not. But you need to make sure in your paper that you've actually cited that rationale for why you think it's a threat, or why you don't think it's, or excuse me, why you think it's a threat for internal validity and why you think it's a threat for external validity. And then also important is, did the authors address these threats? So sometimes a threat might be instrumentation, for example, and they found that their instrument wasn't quite implemented the same in the beginning and the end, and they kind of saw that coming. So they tried to implement a protocol to make it more consistent before and after, but it still was a threat because it wasn't implemented consistently. So that could be an example. If they didn't address those threats, really briefly, again, this could be one sentence, how could they have addressed those threats in the study? And then in the table, you're going to share a full list of all the threats to internal validity and a full list of all the threats to external validity. So that goes in the table. But for those, you don't have to provide, a thorough rationale on how they could have addressed those threats. The table is just a list of all the threats. And then now we get into instruments. So what instruments were used to collect data in the study? Again, a lot of studies will use more than one instrument. We want you to focus on the instrument that relates to your PICO question in the paper. And then additional instruments, maybe they used 5, 10, 15 instruments, can just be listed in the table. So the ones you don't talk about in your paper will show up in the table, in addition to the one you talked about in your paper. So table is comprehensive. The paper is just focusing on your PICO question and what's relevant to it. So then you're going to talk about validity and reliability of those instruments. Did they provide information about validity? Did they provide information about reliability? The most common question we get is, my authors didn't talk about it and they just said, we use this instrument, and then they moved on. If they don't, then you need to talk about what could have been done to enhance validity or what could have been done to enhance reliability, and always provide that rationale for your discussion. And then in the table, obviously, you're going to provide reliability and validity information that you have been provided. So let's say they gave you 10 instruments in the study. You listed them all up in the instrument section of your table, and then down in validity section and down in reliability sections, you can just list those instruments again and say, no data provided, or Chromebox alpha of 0.76 or whatever. So you can provide very straightforward data in the table. Again, you don't have to provide rationale or definitions or anything in the table when you're getting into the other instruments that were included. And then last, we talk about strengths and limitations of this article. So what were the major strengths of the study? Really think about what was done well here, and try to do a little bit more analysis. Sometimes the authors will come out and tell you what the strengths were, but sometimes there's even bigger strengths or more important strengths that you find that they didn't talk about. So pick out the one that you think is most significant in the body of the paper, and then in your table, you're going to have a full list of all of the strengths of the study. Should definitely be more than just 1 or 2 or 3. You need to have a pretty comprehensive list of what was done well in the study. And this sometimes can feel a little repetitive because you might be saying again that the sample was really well developed and it was a strong sample, or maybe again you're talking about how the intervention was really clearly described or whatever. So if you feel a little repetitive in strengths and limitations, that's totally fine. But this is also where some new stuff can come up too. Same thing for limitations. So you're going to come up with what was a main limitation of the study, and then a comprehensive list of limitations in the paper. Just always be sure when you're providing this was a strength or this was a limitation, that you have rationale for not just, well, everybody should understand the strength of the study was the large sample size, but kind of be a little more academic and more scholarly and say, okay, the reason having a large sample size is a strength is XYZ, and provide a citation. So it might feel really obvious to you, but you always need to provide that rationale for the strength or that rationale for the limitation. And then obviously comprehensive list of limitations and strengths in the table. You'll have your references, and then you will have an appendix, and your appendix is your table. So in terms of how you format this, you're going to format it like an appendix with an appendix title and then the table. So you're kind of mixing up formatting a little bit here, but you'll have your title and your appendix centered and bolded in the middle or top of the page, and then you'll include your table right underneath that. So just make sure that you understand that is an appendix of a table. And then the table itself obviously needs to be labeled and have a title also. And again, a lot of times students struggle with the table because they're kind of wondering, what is its place? How does this really work? The idea, kind of like I've been alluding to, is your paper is going to really meet the requirements of the paper, those bullet points we talk about, and focus on the PICO question. And then your table is going to have all of the details, all of the exhaustive data. So like, for example, you might talk about the sample size and the rationale for whether or not that was big enough in your paper, but in the table, you're going to provide demographic data about the sample. You're going to provide any other contextual information, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria in the table itself. So the table is to be comprehensive, and the paper is going to really illuminate what's important to your PICO question and really what shows up in your guidelines. So as always, be sure to submit your paper in PDF so that your formatting isn't distorted, and submit your quantitative study with your paper. So I hope this helps. We always welcome your questions, and best of luck on your paper.